136 hostages are still being held by Hamas terrorists 4 months after the October 7th attacks. They aren't prisoners, fairly or unfairly accused of crimes. These are hostages being held captive by terrorists, not some rational state actor. And yet to many in the media, mostly in the left-leaning media, they continue to cover and talk about the barbaric group as if they were sort of a legitimate entity, almost like they're an actual sort of, functioning government and not a craven band of murderers responsible for unfathomable atrocities. U.S., Egyptian, Qatari, and Israeli officials last week hammered out a framework for an agreement on the release of the hostages, which, like the earlier agreement, would include at least a temporary pause in fighting. Hamas responded this week with a so-called counterproposal, again, even referring to the back and forth as sort of the counterproposals, et cetera. It's sort of even that just legitimizes these terrorists. In the end, their requests are al-Qaeda-like in their delusion and grandeur. Terms and conditions that Israel would never, or should never agree to. They want Israel to release over 1,500 prisoners, and insanely to include captured terrorists who committed the attacks when the hostages were taken. Hamas demands an agreement on a permanent ceasefire in addition to a total withdrawal of Israel from Gaza with Hamas in power. See, they want to try to end up making progress, gains from their terror. Hostage taking, right? But the real point is to just make Israel reject the proposal and then say, oh, they won't accept peace. They're getting help from the media. Hamas is a terror group. They aren't just the other side on a negotiating table in a conflict. They're hostage takers. This is a hostage negotiation, not peace talks in the sense of a conflict between two warring nations. But listening to the partisan media, that's exactly how they're presented. Many in the left-leaning cable outlets are flat out normalizing Hamas. Just look at the dressing that CNN, for example, put around the so-called counterproposal.
They would expect Israel to pull back their forces out of civilian areas, stop all military operations, stop drone activities, open up Gaza so humanitarian aid could get in.
The Hamas three-phase plan proposal, right? Seems pretty reasonable when you put it on the screen like that. It's almost like you're reading about a bill from Congress. And here's MSNBC with a very particular framing.
In the first phase, Hamas would release all Israeli prisoners who are under the age of 19, including those who are sick, and all the remaining women. And in exchange for that, Israel, per Hamas's request, would release about 1,500 Palestinian prisoners, among them 500 that have life sentences or long sentences, including all Palestinian women and children detained since October 7th, part of Israeli operations in the West Bank and what have you.
To be clear, that official-sounding term refers to the leadership of Hamas. That means the ones who orchestrated the October 7th terror attack. Men like Esmail Haniyeh and Yahya Sinwar, who are designated international terrorists. It's interesting, when you hear critics of Israel, they often start out by saying, well, of course, Hamas is bad. And then they tell you why Israel has to be held to a higher standard. Now, think about something you just heard in that MSNBC clip. He referred to the Israeli hostages as prisoners, right? Trying to make it all equal, right? Palestinian prisoners and Israeli prisoners. Oh, yeah. When they send the list of the demands, suddenly they're talked about like they're a legitimate entity. Now, don't misunderstand. Making a deal with Hamas to secure the return of hostages can potentially work. It was done once already, and a temporary ceasefire was part of that deal, and nobody ever wants this war or suffering to continue. So reaching an arrangement that would get the hostages, not prisoners, hostages back home is the goal. But that doesn't change the nature of what this is or what Hamas is. The media are helping to normalize Hamas by treating hostage negotiations like they're international peace talks, by treating a terror group like a legitimate governing body, and by framing this list of what are basically ransom demands like there's some sort of good faith peace proposal between noble opponents. Would the media ever talk about al-Qaeda this way? Yet somehow with Hamas, it's acceptable. See, if you legitimize their absurd demands, then you're indirectly legitimizing what they did and what they're doing. The left-leaning media in particular ought to think about that the next time they present these barbarians as statesmen.
Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find NewsNation on your cable provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.